You're listening to Elder Myths and Shadows, where forgotten tales breathe again. Somewhere in the boreal forests of Canada, where the trees stand close enough to blot out the sky, there is a hunger old enough to have a name. The people who lived among those trees for thousands of years called it Wendigo. Not a myth invented for campfires, but a warning passed down through generations who knew exactly what winter could do to a person. Because this isn't just a story about a monster in the woods. It's a story about what happens to a human being when starvation, isolation, and desperation strip away everything else. And twice in recorded history, real men stood trial for crimes they blamed on becoming one. This is the story of the Wendigo. The word itself comes from the Algonquian language family, spoken by peoples including the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Naskapi, and the Innu. Depending on the dialect, you'll hear it as Wendigo, Wetiko, Witikau, or a dozen other spellings, but the meaning stays close to the same across all of them. Loosely translated, it means something like the evil spirit that devours mankind. Some researchers trace the root further back, to a Proto-Algonquian word connected to the owl, a creature long associated with death and omens in these cultures. Either way, the name was never meant to be spoken lightly. The earliest written record of the legend comes from 1636, in a report by a French Jesuit missionary named Paul Lejeune, living among the Algonquin people in what is now Quebec. Lejeune described local accounts of an evil spirit that had already devoured several people and threatened to devour many more. 25 years later, in 1661, the Jesuit Relations recorded something even stranger. An unnamed ailment that overtook certain men, filling them with a craving for human flesh so severe that their own communities were forced to kill them to stop it. That single sentence, written by a 17th century missionary who didn't fully understand what he was witnessing, may be the first documented case of Wendigo psychosis in history. So what does a Wendigo actually look like? Descriptions vary by nation and by storyteller, but certain details repeat again and again. Ojibwe teacher and scholar Basil Johnston described the creature as gaunt to the point of emaciation. Its skin pulled so tight over its bones that they seemed to push through from the inside. Its complexion was said to be the ash-gray color of a corpse, its lips tattered and stained, its eyes sunk so deep into their sockets that they seemed to have retreated from the light entirely. Some accounts describe a smell surrounding the creature, a mix of decay and corruption, the unmistakable stench of something that should not still be walking. In the traditions of the Ojibwe, Eastern Cree, Naskapi, and Innu specifically, the Wendigo is often described not as human-sized, but as a genuine giant, sometimes 15 feet tall or more. And here's the detail that separates it from almost every other cannibalistic monster in world folklore. The more a Wendigo eats, the larger it grows, which means it can never, ever be full. It is simultaneously starving and gluttonous, a living contradiction, cursed to expand its hunger every time it tries to satisfy it. In some tellings, the creature has a heart made literally of ice, a detail that shows up again and again in oral histories across different nations. In other versions, antlers or horns grow from its skull, an addition that has become especially popular in modern horror media, even though many scholars argue it isn't present in the older, traditional accounts. But the physical description was never really the point. Across nearly every Algonquian-speaking culture, the Wendigo carried the same underlying message: a warning against greed, selfishness, and cannibalism, especially the kind that could tear a community apart during famine. These were peoples whose survival depended entirely on cooperation, on sharing what little food existed during brutal northern winters. In that context, an individual choosing personal survival over the group wasn't just selfish. It was an existential threat to everyone around them. The Wendigo, then, wasn't only a monster to fear in the woods. It was a mirror held up to what a person could become if they let hunger and isolation win. Anthropologist Robert Brightman, who spent years studying Algonquian belief systems, noted how deeply the legend was tied to the material reality of subarctic survival, not just abstract morality. And the legend didn't stay confined to stories told around the fire. Because starting in the late 1800s, real people in real courtrooms were accused of having become one. Our first case begins in the winter of 1878, in what is now Alberta, Canada. A Cree man named Swift Runner, known by his birth name Ka-Ki-Si-Kuchin, had once been a trusted guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. He was tall, physically imposing, and by most accounts, a capable and respected hunter within his community. But heavy drinking during his years working alongside frontier authorities had begun to unravel him, and eventually both the police and his own tribe cut ties with him. Left with nowhere else to turn, Swift Runner took his family deep into the wilderness that winter to hunt and trap, as many Cree families did during the harshest months. With him went his wife, his 6 children, his mother, and his brother. 9 people went into the forest with Swift Runner that winter. Only one of them came out. In the spring of 1879, Swift Runner walked alone into a Catholic mission at St. Albert, claiming his entire family had starved to death over the winter and that he alone had survived. It was a plausible story on its surface, given how brutal that winter had been. But something didn't add up. Swift Runner weighed close to 200 pounds, and by every account looked healthy, well-fed. Nothing like a man who had spent months slowly starving alongside his dying family. The priests at the mission also noticed something else deeply unsettling. Swift Runner was suffering from screaming fits and violent nightmares in his sleep. When they gently pressed him, he told them an evil spirit had been tormenting him, a spirit he called Wendigo. He said little else at first, but it was enough to make the priests deeply uneasy, and they reported their concerns to the authorities. Police escorted Swift Runner back to his family's winter camp in the woods northeast of Edmonton, and what they found there would haunt the officers for the rest of their careers. The site was scattered with human bones. Long bones had been deliberately snapped open, the marrow sucked out, a detail investigators found impossible to reconcile with any story of natural death. One child's body was found intact, having genuinely died of illness and been properly buried. The other 8 members of Swift Runner's family had been reduced to bones and fragments, scattered around the camp like the aftermath of a slaughter. Only 25 miles away sat a Hudson's Bay Company post, stocked with emergency food supplies Swift Runner could have reached in a single day's walk. This detail became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against the idea that this was purely desperate, last-resort survival cannibalism. Under questioning, Swift Runner eventually confessed to the full sequence of events. He admitted to shooting some family members, bludgeoning others, and strangling at least one child with a cord. By some accounts, he had forced one of his surviving sons to help kill and butcher a younger brother before that son, too, was killed. Throughout his confession, Swift Runner maintained that an evil spirit, the Wendigo, had entered him and commanded him to slaughter and consume his own family. The trial began on August 8, 1879, and the jury deliberated for only 20 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Whatever the court believed about spirits and possession, they had no doubt about who had committed the killings. Swiftrunner was sentenced to hang at Fort Saskatchewan, and the execution was set for December 20th, 1879. It would become the first legal hanging in the history of Alberta. Roughly 60 Cree and Métis trappers gathered at dawn to witness it, some of them huddled around a fire they'd built from the wood of the old gallows trapdoor the night before. Guards later described Swiftrunner as unnervingly calm in his final days, at one point converting to Catholicism, and even joking with his jailer about how well-fed the constable looked. On the morning of the execution, delays pushed the hanging back as officials scrambled to fix a broken gallows and forgotten restraints, while Swiftrunner reportedly sat by the fire eating pemmican with the noose already loose around his neck. When he was finally given the chance to address the crowd, he openly admitted his guilt one last time. Swiftrunner is remembered today as one of the only documented cases where a person killed others while believing he himself had become a Wendigo, rather than being killed by others trying to stop one. His case would go on to be cited for over a century in psychiatric and anthropological literature as the defining example of what researchers came to call Wendigo psychosis. But Swiftrunner's story is only half of this darker, real-world chapter of the legend. Because nearly 30 years later, in the same region of Canada, a very different kind of Wendigo case would end in a courtroom. This time, the man on trial wasn't accused of becoming a Wendigo. He was accused of killing one. His name was Jack Fiddler, known in his own language as Jawano Gijigo Gaba, meaning he who stands in the southern sky. Fiddler was the Ogima, or chief and shaman, of the Sucker clan of the Anishinaabe people, living in the remote boreal forests of what is now northwestern Ontario. He had inherited his role in part from his father, a respected medicine man known as Porcupine Standing Sideways, who had also been feared and revered for his power to fight off the Wendigo. By the early 1900s, Jack Fiddler's people were among the very last indigenous nations in North America still living almost entirely outside Canadian government control, governed instead by their own laws and traditions. Within that world, Fiddler held enormous authority, not through weapons or wealth, but through his reputation as someone capable of standing against a very specific kind of threat. He claimed, over the course of his life, to have defeated 14 Wendigos. Some, he said, had been sent against his people by rival shamans. Others were members of his own community who had become consumed by an insatiable, incurable hunger for human flesh, showing the early signs of transformation. In those cases, it was often the sick person's own family who came to Fiddler, begging him to intervene before their loved one killed someone. Sometimes, according to accounts passed down through his community, the afflicted person themselves asked to be killed, terrified of what they were becoming and desperate to spare others from it. This wasn't murder in the way outside observers understood it. Within Fiddler's world, it was closer to a mercy killing, a final act of protection for the wider community, carried out only as a last resort and only by someone with the spiritual authority to do it. Fiddler's own brother, Peter Flett, reportedly died this way after turning Wendigo when supplies ran out during a difficult trading expedition. Hudson's Bay Company traders, missionaries, and neighboring Cree communities were all well aware of the Wendigo belief, and company records from the era document multiple documented instances of people turning cannibal, whether interpreted as possession, mental illness, or simple desperation. Jack Fiddler's reputation for handling these crises only grew, and even Christian missionaries in the region reportedly sought him out, hoping to convert a man whose spiritual authority clearly ran deep. He respectfully declined every time. Then, in September 1906, a woman named Wasakapikwe, the daughter-in-law of Fiddler's brother Joseph, fell severely and incurably ill. She displayed episodes of extreme restlessness, requiring several women to physically restrain her, interpreted by those around her as early signs of Wendigo transformation. Jack and Joseph Fiddler were called in. What exactly happened next would later be pieced together through conflicting eyewitness testimony at trial. But the outcome was the same. Wasakapikwe was killed, in what her community understood as a mercy killing, meant to prevent a far worse fate for everyone around her. Nearly 2 years passed with no outside intervention. Then, in early 1907, officers of the Northwest Mounted Police visiting Island Lake heard rumors of Jack Fiddler's reputation for defeating Wendigos, passed along by an in-law of the family. Curious and skeptical of what they were hearing, the Mounties traveled to the sucker camp at Deer Lake and arrested both Jack and Joseph Fiddler for murder. It was, in many ways, the moment Canadian law formally arrived in this remote corner of the country for the very first time. Jack Fiddler was likely somewhere in his late 70s or even 80s by this point in his life. Rather than face trial, he escaped custody and made his way toward Norway House, where he took his own life before the case could go to court. His brother Joseph was left to stand trial alone, without legal representation. A local newspaper ran the case under the sensationalized headline, "Devil Worship Among the Cree," turning a deeply complicated cultural and legal collision into a lurid news story for outside readers. Some white acquaintances of the Fiddlers attempted to testify on Joseph's behalf, trying to explain the cultural context behind what had happened. The presiding magistrate, Aylesworth Bowen Perry, was unmoved, reportedly stating plainly that no traditional belief system could justify what Canadian law forbade. Joseph Fiddler was convicted and sentenced to death. Further appeals eventually secured a pardon and his release from custody. But the order arrived 3 days too late. Joseph Fiddler had already died in prison. With both of their most powerful spiritual leaders gone, the Sucker people had little choice left but to accept the imposition of Canadian government rule over their community. Jack Fiddler's son, Robert, would go on to sign an addition to Treaty 5 in 1910, formally bringing his father's once independent people under federal authority for the first time in their history. 2 men, 2 very different Wendigo cases. One who believed he had become the monster. One who believed it was his sacred duty to stop others from becoming it. Both cases ended the same way, in a courtroom that had no framework at all for understanding what these communities had lived with for generations. So what actually happened to men like Swift Runner? In the decades since, doctors and anthropologists have debated the answer extensively, coining the term Wendigo psychosis to describe it. Historically, it was defined as a culture-bound syndrome, a set of symptoms shaped specifically by the cultural beliefs of the people experiencing it. Early accounts describe a progression. First, a loss of appetite, nausea, and vomiting, followed by an escalating delusion that the sufferer was transforming into a Wendigo. As the delusion deepened, victims reportedly began to see the people around them as edible, even as they remained horrified by their own cravings. Some researchers, like anthropologist Vivian Rorel, proposed that severe nutritional deficiency during long winters could genuinely trigger psychological symptoms resembling this pattern. Others have argued something more skeptical, that Wendigo psychosis may have functioned less as a distinct medical illness and more as a culturally understood explanation, a shared language a community could use to make sense of otherwise incomprehensible acts of violence. Anthropologist Lou Morano published an influential and controversial paper in 1982 arguing exactly this, suggesting many so-called Wendigo psychosis cases were better explained as strategic killings within community power struggles, dressed in the language of possession. Modern psychiatry no longer formally recognizes Wendigo psychosis as a diagnosable disorder. But the debate over what really happened to Swift Runner, and to the people Jack Fiddler was called upon to stop, has never fully been settled. Was it genuine starvation-induced madness? A culturally specific channel for extreme trauma and isolation? Or, in at least some cases, something closer to premeditated violence given a supernatural justification after the fact? Researchers studying the region have pointed to comparisons with other well-documented survival cannibalism cases, like the Donner Party in the American West or the 1972 Andes plane crash, situations where extreme starvation pushed ordinary people toward almost unthinkable acts. The difference is that Algonquian cultures had already built an entire spiritual framework, centuries deep, for understanding and processing exactly that horror when it happened within their own communities. And it's worth remembering, virtually all documented Wendigo killings, aside from Swift Runner's, were the reverse of his case. They were community members ending the threat before it could spread, not individuals attacking out of possession themselves. That distinction is easy to lose in modern retellings, but it changes the entire moral shape of the legend. This wasn't simply a monster story. It was, in a very real sense, an entire community's early framework for identifying and responding to extreme psychological crisis, generations before the word psychiatry even existed. So does anything still walk those forests today? Sightings of an actual creature, as opposed to psychological cases, dropped off sharply after the 1920s, but they never fully stopped. Reports have persisted for decades in specific pockets of northern Ontario, particularly around a site known locally as the Cave of the Wendigo, and near the town of Kenora. In northern Minnesota, witnesses near Roseau reported repeated Wendigo appearances from the late 1800s through the 1920s, with locals claiming that each sighting was followed by an unexpected death in the community. Modern reports tend to cluster in the same remote lake country, around Bemidji, Leech Lake, and Cass Lake in Minnesota. Deep in the same subarctic terrain the legend has always called home. Contemporary witnesses describe a strikingly consistent figure, a tall, skeletal humanoid, sometimes over 7 feet in height, with ash-gray skin stretched tight over an unnaturally thin frame. Its limbs are often described as too long for its body, ending in claw-like fingers, and its eyes as deep-set and unnervingly focused. Several accounts describe an immediate, unnatural drop in temperature whenever the creature is nearby, along with an eerie silence, as if the surrounding wildlife has gone completely still. Some witnesses claim the Wendigo doesn't attack directly, but stalks from a distance, patiently waiting for exhaustion, confusion, or a moment of separation from the group. A number of accounts even describe the creature mimicking human voices from the tree line, calling out in familiar tones in an apparent attempt to lure someone away from safety. As recently as 2019, hikers in the Canadian wilderness reported hearing unexplained, distinctly non-animal howls echoing through the forest at night, reigniting local speculation once again. Skeptics point to more grounded explanations. Large, malnourished animals like bears, moose, or wolves can appear disturbingly gaunt and human-like in low light and heavy snow. Isolation itself is also a well-documented psychological stressor, and extreme cold, exhaustion, and prolonged solitude in the wilderness can produce very real, very convincing hallucinations. Whether you find that explanation reassuring or find it somehow even more unsettling is entirely up to you. What's undeniable is how far the legend has traveled from its origins. The Wendigo entered the wider English-speaking world in 1910 through Algernon Blackwood's horror novella simply titled The Wendigo, which introduced the creature to readers who had never heard an Algonquian story in their lives. From there, it spread rapidly into modern horror fiction, video games, and television, appearing in everything from Stephen King's Pet Sematary to network shows like Supernatural, Grimm, and Charmed. Marvel Comics gave it a hulking, antlered redesign that has since become the default image most people picture when they hear the word Wendigo, even though many scholars note that image bears little resemblance to the original traditional descriptions. Indigenous scholars and writers have increasingly pushed back on these modern portrayals, arguing that stripping the creature down to a simple monster erases the deeper cultural warning it was always meant to carry. Author and scholar Jack D. Forbes went even further in his influential 1978 book, using the Wendigo as a powerful metaphor for the destructive, insatiable greed underlying colonialism and exploitation on a civilizational scale. In that reading, the real Wendigo was never confined to the forest at all. It was, and perhaps still is, a warning about what unchecked hunger for more, land, power, resources, wealth, does to any society that lets it go unchecked. 2 real men were tried in Canadian courtrooms for crimes connected to this legend. One believed the spirit had entered him. One believed it was his sacred duty to stop it from spreading. Both stories end in tragedy, shaped by starvation, isolation, and a collision between 2 completely different systems of law and belief. And somewhere in those same northern forests, in the same brutal winters that gave birth to the legend in the first place, people are still occasionally reporting a tall, gaunt figure watching them from the tree line. Whether it's a monster, a memory, or simply the oldest warning North America ever told itself about what hunger can do to a human soul, the Wendigo has never stopped walking. And if you ever find yourself alone in the deep woods on a freezing winter night, and you hear something calling your name from just beyond the trees, don't answer it. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Comment what topic you'd like to see next. Another whisper awaits, if you dare.